All right, go ahead. I'll give you the clicker here somewhere. Well, you have to do it without. Just hit the space bar and the arrows. Okay, go ahead.
So my source is History of the Franks, which is a chronicle written by Gregory of Tours. So it pretty much starts in 476 because the fall of the Western Roman Empire left a power struggle between the Goths, the Burgundians, and a large confederation of smaller Germanic tribes called the Alemanni, or all men. And in between all of this were small pocket remains of the Western Roman Empire still trying to survive. Then around this time, the Franks moved south into Gaul from the northern regions near the Rhine. And about a couple years later, in 481, Clovis succeeded his father Childeric as the king of the Salian Franks. The Franks at this time were only a large confederation of Germans who roughly had the same language and customs. But Clovis was the first of those kings who united all the Frankish people into a single kingdom for the purpose of gaining power in Gaul. He was also the Frankish king that converted the Franks to Catholicism in the late 480s, thus making the Franks the first major Germanic kingdom to adopt the Roman faith. Gregory of Tours lived long after Clovis died. Gregory lived about 538 to 954. Clovis died in 511. However, Gregory, in the later years of his life as a monk, wrote a chronicle summarizing the major events of how the Frankish kingdom in Gaul was established. And Clovis, of course, was one of the most important figures in Gregory's writing. So, Gregory sort of explains how royal culture worked with the Franks. Germanic kings were born but did not have unlimited power. Only priests could order the punishment or imprisonment of individuals. Interestingly, though, the Salic law dictated that anyone who killed a man of the king's trust was liable to pay up to 24,000 denarii, which essentially meant you pretty much couldn't hurt anybody who the king saw as a friend, essentially. And although they weren't arbitrary rules, it seemed like it was generally acceptable for a Frankish king to kill any soldier who disrespected him or disobeyed a direct order, as evidenced by an incident in which Clovis personally beheaded a soldier who smashed a vase that he wanted. And then when he assembled the army to inspect all of their gear, that same soldier had rusty chainmail and a badly serviced sword. This would definitely make it seem that Clovis had arbitrary authority that made him exempt from the Salic law, but it's likely that it was more of an unspoken social norm among the Franks rather than legal authority. Now, Gregory initially describes Clovis as a devout pagan who refused to accept Jesus in spite of his Catholic wife. Now, however, the inciting incident came sometime in about 486 when the Franks went to war with the Alemanni. At some point during one major engagement, Clovis's personal army, according to Gregory, began to be in danger of destruction, whatever that means exactly. The problem with these chronicles is that they're way too vague. Gregory doesn't really explain exactly how things happened. He just says that they happened. And this is just a thing that all chroniclers in the early Middle Ages do, which is really what makes this history so murky. That's the real reason why I think it's called the Dark Ages. But moving on from that tangent. However, seeing that his army was in danger of slaughter, Clovis suddenly cried out to God to save them. He renounced all the old gods he had been worshiping and promised to accept baptism as a Christian if God granted his Franks victory. And then Gregory writes that as soon as Clovis prayed this, the Alemanni army suddenly turned and ran. This is definitely an exaggeration, as there is no plausible way that there's no plausible way that all of the Alemanni saw Clovis praying, for one thing, in the middle of a massive chaotic melee. And if they were about to break the Frankish formation and slaughter them, there's no way they'd just turn away and run. Now, as a Christian, I obviously believe that God definitely had an impact in this battle, and Clovis's prayer was that spiritual factor that put the Franks in God's favor. But I don't believe that the entire Alemanni army would just dissolve like that, just on a whim like that. I believe it also required the legwork of Clovis's warriors, who could definitely argue were empowered by God. But if they were close to breaking formation, they would have had to fight their way out of that situation in order to rout the Alemanni. But really, it's likely that Gregory wrote this account in this way to assert the dominance of God over the old Germanic pagan gods. In other words, he's pushing an agenda which was common for all chronicles across Europe at this time. It's just how they wrote things, which is kind of what makes these chronicles not so reliable. And it seems that the Franks were most shaken in their pagan faith by the victory that God granted them against the Alemanni. If that's what it took for Clovis's warriors to renounce the old gods, because not long after this random engagement in an unnamed place, Clovis asked his entire army if they were willing to renounce the old gods and become Christians, and apparently they all accepted and got baptized willingly. So it seems that this seriously shook their faith in the old gods, that the old gods couldn't help them, but Jesus did. And post-conversion, Clovis and his warriors seemed to give God the same measure of devotion that they had given their old gods. They even revered church saints to such a degree that Clovis strictly forbade any plundering of resources from the home province of St. Martin, and immediately killed one of his soldiers who did just that. Now, you would think it's just common practice to not plunder any provinces, but when you think about it, this is early Middle Ages where resources and food are scarce, and so an army plundering a province for food and weapons and some money, that's just common practice and common sense. They need a logistical train somehow. But when they were in the home province of St. Martin, Clovis addresses all of his officers saying, "We cannot plunder any place at all in this entire province. This is a home of a blessed saint. We cannot touch it." So in my personal opinion, Clovis probably began to seriously ponder the power of God when his wife Clotilda prayed for the healing of their second son, who was completely healed of some unnamed sickness that was killing him, in spite of Clovis's initial scorn against God. And not long after this time, Clovis's wife had a monk named Saint Remy to come over and preach to the palace and preach to Clovis. And Gregory writes that this saint was a master orator who was very good at giving convincing sermons as to why one should join the faith. Gregory's chronicle also gives us the slight impression that Clovis approved of the orderly and respectful conduct of Christianity, as evidenced by his punishment of greed, vandalism, thievery, and soissons. Well, thievery and disrespect. I must spoke there. So, not long after this time, when they passed through the province of St. Martin, the Eastern Roman Empire granted Clovis the title of consulship. This was a big deal because, as far as I'm aware, they'd never done this to any German monarch at all. Now, even though at this time the title of Roman consul was nothing more than a formality at this point, receiving an appointment to consulship from the Eastern Roman Emperor Anastasius apparently put Clovis in a really good mood, as he rode his horse out of the St. Martin's Church and generously gave handfuls of gold and silver to people who were all lining the church entrance. And once again, even if this was just formality, it said something. It said that the emperor of the Romans, Anastasius, personally respects this man, And however, the source book implies that the consulship was simply an honorary title with no practical authority behind it, as Clovis does not appear in any of the Eastern Roman Empire's list of consuls. But nonetheless, the stories that Gregory shows of Clovis seems to display that he was a leader of strict order and discipline who had no problem punishing any of his warriors who acted out of line. He appeared to have strengthened his standards of discipline within his own army upon converting to Catholicism and punished any looting that took place in the city of a saint. He was definitely much more Romanized than any previous Frankish king. If he was given a consulship from the Eastern Roman Empire, formality or not, you could definitely say he was more Romanized than most of the Franks. Even without considering his consulship, though, the Salic law kind of flew in the face of many of the Roman stereotypes of most Germans in general. We always read from the Roman sources that they were barbarians who just destroyed and killed everything. But unlike a more destructive German nation like the Vandals, the Franks, especially with their Salic law, enforced civility among each other and even civility towards Romans. A particular fine of punishment was directed towards violent behavior. So the actions that Clovis takes in Gregory's account seem to reinforce this orderly reputation, especially after he accepted God. Now, the book asks what kind of social standards that change, at least that you notice in the Chronicle. The only major social standard that I noticed while reading the Chronicle was that the Franks collectively turned towards Catholicism, which stood in stark contrast to the pagan practices and Arian Christianity that had dominated Western Europe since the fall of the West Empire. And the statement that it's also stated by one historian in the source book that Gregory presented the history of the Franks as a constant battle between the forces of God and the devil. And I think this is accurate. This is pretty much a single sentence summary of Gregory's overall agenda in writing this chronicle. I don't think he was much really interested in giving a completely factual history of the Frankish kingdom, but more just promoting the power of God over the old ways. But as I said, this is how all chroniclers wrote. Gregory also championed Clovis's conversion to Catholicism and paints it as a positive turning point in Frankish society that gave them the moral and practical advantage against their Arian and pagan enemies. And once again, that's just how chronicles were written, and that's all I have.
Well, very good. Do we have any questions? Comments? Okay. Very good.